Hello, you. Welcome to the Saxon series, a series of podcasts in which we discuss an obscure language that's been hiding in plain sight for quite a while. Low Saxon, or, as it's also known, Low German, the continental cousin of English. In this episode, we'll cover the basics first. What is Low Saxon, and why does it have so many names? How does it compare to English and other languages? What are its typical features? That sort of thing. Sit back, relax, and be amazed. Alright, so my name is Martin ter Denge. I live in Twente, the Netherlands, and I'm 35 years old. That's the sort of thing you want to know, Chris, or what?
Sure, yeah.
Alright, so that's that. I run a podcast called Veelspraken. It usually is in Low Saxon, on the topic of Low Saxon or whatever wide variety of topics that includes. And Chris invited me to, for once in our entire life, host a podcast on Low Saxon in English, because that's a first. We have podcasts on Low Saxon in Dutch. We have podcasts on Low Saxon in German. We have podcasts on Low Saxon, heck, in Low Saxon even, but we've never discussed Low Saxon in English. Am I right?
Exactly. Okay. And so from my end, I'm Chris Canter. Not sure if I should introduce my age at this point. Well, why not? It gives a more complete picture. So I'm 40. We are both from the Dutch province of Overijssel in Low Saxon, which is within the Low Saxon area. So the northeast of the country where Low Saxon as a regional language is spoken alongside Dutch, and which adjoins northern Germany where Low Saxon or Low German is also spoken. So just like you said, there are precious few resources on the internet. Not many written resources, let alone spoken audio recordings about the language or group of languages called, or language grouping called Low Saxon, or Plattdeutsch, Plattdeutsch. Many names abound.
That's correct.
Precious little information in English. Yeah. And I just had a look earlier today at YouTube videos currently in English about Low Saxon, and noticed that, there's only a handful to begin with, maybe about a dozen. They're mostly by English speakers, that is to say outsiders who have a knack for languages or an interest in languages, but they're not speakers of the language, right? They're not speakers of the language that we're talking about today. So
they lack inside knowledge.
Well, yeah, they don't speak the language to begin with. They will know some phrases, and of course they're to be applauded for taking an interest, but clearly their knowledge is going to be limited. Some of these videos are they speak about the better known variety of Low Saxon, which is Low German, Plattdeutsch. Often it's called it's called by the High German name, Plattdeutsch, which is like an exonym, right? It's like discussing English and saying, okay, today we're going to talk about English, and using just the German word for English.
Yeah, that's right. And it's an interesting question as well, because most people from Germany tend to refer to it as something of their own, like Low German. And scholarly debate always, for some reason, decides they want to use the word Low German, and it sort of causes a rift between the Dutch speakers and the German speakers, and the German speakers, they generally are quite unaware of that this language also exists outside of their own country, right? So in the Netherlands as well as in Denmark, and pockets of speakers in the Baltic states, and even up to Kazakhstan, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that the language name, the name of the language decides on how you perceive it?
Oh, absolutely. And there is a plethora of names or non-names, because for many speakers, it hasn't got a name other than dialect, for instance.
Right.
Which is a non-name. I spoke the other day with a French friend, and she talked about the patois, the local patois in a part of France that she picked up some things about as a child. And the point being that patois does not, like dialect, does not designate any specific language. Rather, it's just a word to designate all non-standard varieties. So you have French, standard French in France, and then you've got everything else, maybe excluding a totally different language like Breton, but all regional languages related to French are just sort of tarred with a broad brush and lumped together as just patois, or in our case, whether it's Zealandic or Brabantian or Utrechtian, whatever kind of language variety.
Yep.
It's all dialect. It's non-standard. It's
lumped together, right? That's right, and mostly the speakers themselves do it as well. They oppose it to ABN, like standard civilized Dutch, as opposed to I speak dialect, right? That's what you mean.
Well, there's a value judgment implied in the use of dialect.
Exactly. Exactly. There's a judgment in there.
Yeah. Well, exactly. There tends to be a judgment implied, even though you could say, well, a dialect is just a language that hasn't been defined and standardized, and is not developed in the same respects as a standard language is. For the group of language varieties we're talking about, I'll just riff off a couple of the names that are in use. So we call it Low Saxon in English, which is a translation of Neder-Saxisch, which is what it's currently called in a more official sense in the Netherlands. In German Low Saxon, also known as Low German, it's often called Plattdeutsch, or Platt for short. In Dutch, it's also often called Platt, which means flat, or from the lowlands of Northern Europe. And then,
or maybe shallow even. Because I get the feeling that the Germans have a different idea about what Platt means than the Dutch do, because Dutch people can also call other unrelated dialects to Low Saxon. They can also call them Platt, like for instance Platt-Hagenees. Like there's, as you said, there's a judgment in there. Like it isn't. You can't have a thorough discussion in this language. It's flat. It's shallow. It's So I have a bit of an idea that in Germany they have a different idea of what Platt means. They usually say that it refers to the lower lying areas of Germany, the northern parts, whereas as opposed to High German from the higher regions, the more alpine regions. But in our country, everything's flat. So we don't have that separation, right? We don't have that distinction between lowlands and highlands. So in my opinion, the idea of what Platt means is different.
Sure. So, in other words, it can be understood in different ways. It can be taken as a neutral term. It can also be taken as something denoting just some local, rather unrefined variety of speech. Like you said, Platt-Hagenees refers to Dutch as it's or Hollandic Dutch as it's spoken in the city of The Hague, often spoken by laborers and not so much by highly educated people because of the stigma attached to regional languages, which doesn't mean that any language variety is linguistically less refined or less grammatically developed than any other variety, but it's just about the social prestige attached to it or not. And then just to round out this listing of endless names for our language, in Dutch, another term in use is streektaal, or regional language, which is, I tend to use it often because it's fairly neutral, though any name will have its defenders and detractors. And then essentially, and this goes to the heart of how our language is perceived, it's often not given an overarching name at all by speakers, but is referred to as the language of either the region, by the name of the region they're from, or even by the city, town, or village they're from. Okay, so if you're from the province of Overijssel, you can say, well, I speak Overijssels, which is not a very common thing to say because there's a lot of variety within the province. So you could say within the region of Salland in Overijssel, you say, I speak Sallands. Or if you're from the town of Neologism, you say, well, I speak Neologisms. Okay. Which is fair enough because there's a lot of variety from town to town, but it sort of prevents you from seeing the bigger picture, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's a very diluted image. And it's like a divide and conquer sort of strategy. Like if we're so focused on these little differences, these little pronunciation differences, like you'll find all over the world, you'll never be able to see the bigger picture of it actually being quite the same from town to town. And about 89% of it will be the same. There's only a slight difference in pronunciation from town to town. And when everything's so much the same, only these small differences will stand out, and that's what we'll focus on. So that's how that idea came about of every village or every town having its own variety.
Sure.
But on a basic level, they're all the same, right? Or else we wouldn't be able to understand each other.
Sure, and understanding up to a point is about how closely related or how distant two given language varieties are to or from each other. But what's also involved is, do I want to understand somebody else, right? Is there the goodwill? Is there the interest? I can just hear in my head someone say, "Oh, kan niks van verstaan." I don't. It's Greek. It's Greek to me.
Right.
Can't make out a word of what they're babbling on about. Right. So, whereas someone else who may hear the same and has the same information and hear the same language variety and say, "Oh, hang on, I can make out this and that." So depending on their attitude. But I think at this point, this is kind of the sociological side of things. We should continue to define what the hell we're actually talking about. So we're talking about a group of related language varieties that we call Low Saxon and a million other names that are spoken in essentially like the home turf, northern Germany and the northeastern Netherlands. And then it's spoken in some areas of the world where people from this part of Europe have immigrated, like the Americas and so on. I guess we should characterize it as a West Germanic language variety, just like, Dutch and English and German.
And Frisian and Limburgish and whatever.
Yes, and Bavarian and what have you. Just the Germanic spoken in the northwestern corner of Europe that does not include the Scandinavian languages, which are classed as North Germanic, although they're kind of closely related as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a different pickle, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, no.
Well, we could delve into that later on, but
like you said, we could do a series of 20 recordings discussing and hashing out the different aspects of this topic, and maybe we'll end up doing that. Who knows? So I would say that, doing this in English and speaking, like trying to make sense on the topic of Low Saxon in a comprehensive way, pretty much for the first time on the internet, in audio, because a book came out last year on Low Saxon in English for the lay public, which is an interesting development and kind of unique.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that for English speaker, anyone interested in the English language, we'll get back to the literature I just referred to later. But anyone interested in the English language should understand that Low Saxon is one of the languages on earth most closely related to English, with very similar roots, and therefore of special interest to anyone who takes a kind of linguistic or historic or what have you interest in English. And that should include quite a large group of people.
Very well.
The earliest, I'll just wrap up and give you the floor again, but the earliest stage of English is not known as Anglo-Saxon for nothing, right? English arose from a number of Germanic varieties that include the language of the Angles and the Saxons that migrated from continental Europe to Britain. And Low Saxon, or, sometimes just inclined to call it Saxon because low really doesn't add much because there's no high Saxon. Low Saxon is derived from Old Saxon, which is basically the home language of the tribe of the Saxons that arose sometime, I guess, after the Roman Empire in a period of history that is rather cloudy. But as the word itself is clear enough. I mean, there's Anglo-Saxon, there's Old Saxon. Both are Saxon. So English is, although hugely developed with a lot of subsequent influences mixed in, is a form of Saxon. And the language we're discussing, Low Saxon, is a form of Saxon.
That's right. Very well. That's it. Done. Thank you very much. No, you're quite right, and many traits of that are still very visible and very audible, even in, like, for instance, the basic vocabulary. Like, there's you have these basic words, like, for describing lots of different things, like, of course your body parts or stuff that you use on a daily basis, like. For English speakers, people will probably recognize the word hoose, like from Scottish hoose, where people live, a dwelling, a house. And that word is the same in Low Saxon. Just to give you a few examples, we have the word kne, which spells Knee. And in English, that's the word for knee, right? But we've retained the original pronunciation. And in Chris's case, he is more or less traversed the same path as English has, only they've stopped at deleting the K. So you'd say knie, I think. We say kne, and these are, dialectal differences in Low Saxon. But they give you a clear idea that, on a vocabulary basis, we're very much related.
Yes, and one example that shouldn't be passed over is one that's often mentioned when contrasting Low Saxon with Dutch in words such as, or I'll first say them in English, old and shoulder, which in Low Saxon are old and skolder. Now, depending on the variety, it could vary a little, but anyway, that's how I would say it, which in Dutch is oud schouder. So where in Dutch you get a diphthong, two vowel sounds, in both English and Low Saxon, and in High German, it must be said, this middle consonant, the L, is retained. So old in Saxon is old. It's written exactly the same. In fact, in High German or Standard German, it's alt, right? Which also has the L. This is where it's differentiated from Dutch. In Frisian, interestingly enough, alt is written A-L-D, but the L is not pronounced. And I looked up shoulder in Frisian, skouder, so there's no L there either. Although in general, I would say that Low Saxon has a lot in common with Frisian that it does not with Dutch. So there's obviously Frisian is spoken in areas not just adjoining Low Saxon language areas, but actually overlapping. Yeah, that's the famous case where, okay, so Frisian is mostly still alive in one province, Friesland, in the Netherlands. In Germany, it's almost died out. It's spoken in a handful of tiny towns or villages with a couple thousand speakers left. And it was actually replaced not by High German, but earlier still by
Low Saxon. Thank you very much.
You guessed it.
Yes. Yeah. And
no, you know it.
So would you say that you'd be able to find traces of that Frisian history in the Low Saxon spoken there?
Yes. I mean, going back to the Netherlands, if you look at the province of Grun, in our beautiful tongue, in Standard Dutch Groningen, the Low Saxon spoken there has a Frisian substrate, right? As does the so-called, this is getting complex, but in Germany, there's East Frisia, which is a region where East Frisian is the name used for a group of varieties that are not actually Frisian, but that are Low Saxon.
Yes.
But they get the name of that region. So it's called East Frisian Low Saxon, even though it's not Frisian. But true enough, it would have retained features of the earlier Frisian spoken in the area before that was replaced X centuries ago by Low Saxon, which was then in our modern times largely replaced, although not completely yet, by Standard German or across the border by Standard Dutch.
That's very much correct. And to confuse you even further, there is also a West Frisian dialect of Dutch that's spoken in the province of North Holland. So
did you have to bring that up?
Yeah. So yes, it's quite a pickle to untangle the Low Saxon language, especially in the border cases of Gronings and what have you, like West Veluws and Stellingwars, because the jury's out on whether those are proper Low Saxon dialects even, because it's very hard to define what is and what isn't.
I wouldn't say the jury is out in the sense that, I'm actually not sure whether, for instance, in the covenant that came into force in the Netherlands only about 2 or 3 years ago, recognizing Low Saxon as a regional language. It had former recognition, but it was given like a new affirmation of official recognition.
Symbolic.
Whether it doesn't...
I must add, symbolic.
Sure. But those are the politics. We'll get into that later. But I'm not sure whether that defines the varieties of what actually counts as Low Saxon. I don't know off the top of my head. Anyway, at this point, I could maybe slip in something I wrote down just to go back to the similarities between Frisian and Low Saxon and how it compares to Dutch. A few examples that I just found rather quickly, but also to give an idea of what Low Saxon actually sounds like and what these closely related varieties sound like. Otherwise, it will all sound rather theoretical. But what the hell kind of language are we actually talking about, right? So I found just on the Frisian Wikipedia the title of a novel, De Soldaat die het weerom kwam, meaning the soldier who came back, which in my variety of Low Saxon, when I speak Low Saxon, I'll generally just use what speak the variety I'm familiar with. De soldaat die als weerom kwam. So Frisian, de soldaat die het weerom kwam. Low Saxon, de soldaat die als weerom kwam. In
een soldaat die het weer kwam.
Ja. In Dutch, de soldaat die terugkwam. And I also selected that not just because of the vocabulary thingy where you notice that the Frisian and Saxon share weerom kwam, whereas in Dutch it's slightly different, but also because the Frisian feature of you got the demonstrative pronoun die, that, or who, which is then followed by, of course I looked this up because I'm not that much of a grammarian as to know all of this by heart, but followed by a conjunction, namely at in Frisian, die het, meaning die at. I guess the English equivalent would be who that came back.
Right.
It's just a peculiarity, which I mentioned because it also exists in many varieties of Low Saxon. The soldaat die as weerom kwam. I know it's used in Drents, it's used in Overijssels, it's used in Achterhoeks, which it has in common with Frisian. A second example, deze taalvorm is enkel bewaren bleven in kaarten. This language form was preserved only on maps, if I translated that correctly. In Low Saxon, deze taalvorm is enkel bewaard gebleven op kaarten. How would you say it?
Deze taalvorm is enkel bewaard gebleven op kaarten.
Ja. In Dutch, deze taalvorm is enkel of alleen maar bewaard gebleven op kaarten. Deze taalvorm is enkel bewaard gebleven op kaarten. Now, the past participle here in Frisian is bleven. In the recent, your variety of Low Saxon, it's...
It depends on the situation, but I think what you're getting at is the bleven and bleven. Bleven of bleven.
So either it's literally the same as Frisian, or you have the schwa at the beginning, bleven.
Right.
And in my variety, it's bleven. In many varieties of Drents, it's bleven. And in Dutch, it's gebleven. So the Dutch has this prefix ge, which does not exist in Low Saxon, either not at all, or the only thing that's retained is the schwa.
I think it exists. I think it exists in some pockets of Achterhoeks, but I think mainly in the south. Gebleven.
Yes, because that's where it blends in with Low Franconian varieties that are not Saxon proper. So it starts to overlap in features. And gosh, maybe looking back, this is way too much detail. We can even cut it out if needed. But a third example, the last one, is a Frisian sentence which I wrote down is: Er bestaat geen beweging die er een aparte letter van het alfabet van meidje wil. There is no movement that wanted to make it into a separate letter of the alphabet. Low Saxon, er bestaat geen beweging die als er een aparte letter van het alfabet van maken wil. In Dutch, er bestaat geen beweging die er een aparte letter van het alfabet van wilde maken. This is about verb order, where in Frisian and Low Saxon, the infinitive to make, meidje, maken, comes first and is followed by the conjugated finite verb. Wanted, vol, in Frisian, in Saxon, vol. W-O-L. In Dutch, it's the other way round. Wilde maken. Wanted to make. In Frisian and Saxon, to make wanted. Which is a fundamental difference characterizing Frisian and Saxon on the one hand, and Standard Dutch on the other hand. They're called, respectively, the green and red verb orders, based on the coloring of a language map once done by, I believe, Jordan, a linguist.
Mm-hmm.
Bit of a grammatical deep dive, right?
Very nice. Thank you very much. We love that. And anything else? Because there's other grammatical things that are, we were talking about the similarities between Low Saxon and English. One thing that's stood out to me is like, for instance, in where have you been? In a question, right? Where have you been? There's the verb to have in there. In Dutch it would be waar ben jij geweest? With the verb been. Waar ben jij geweest? Where have you been? But in Low Saxon we ask waar heb je wees? Where have you been? There's the use of the have as well. And I think that's a bit of an overlooked similarity. Same goes for the use of do, like a sort of a strengthener. Like, what are you doing? I do read. Like, wat doe je? Ik doe lezen. If you know what I'm getting at. And there's certain things that are happening in our varieties of Low Saxon that are also happening, or at least somewhere present in English, which are absent in Dutch. So,
if you take the past tense of that particular example, I did read.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose in Twents, your variety of Low Saxon, that would be ik deed lezen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, in English, you would normally say I read, or I have read, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You only would say I did read to emphasize that, yes, I was actually reading. I did read. No, you were just lying on the beach. No, I did read the text you asked me to read. But up until just about the time of Shakespeare, I did read, as you can find back in poetry of the day, was standard English.
Mm-hmm.
So just like in Low Saxon, that verb did, like an auxiliary verb, was used not for emphasis, but as a matter of course, just as an observation.
And I think if you dig into the more northern German varieties of Low Saxon, you'll find that that the use of do, the auxiliary verb to do, is very much more present in those varieties on a daily basis, very much more part of their daily speech. We in Twente use do for emphasis as well, but they use it as a certain standard, like they use do for everything.
Well, yes, and obviously all German Low Saxon varieties without question use do, for the simple reason, the only reason really, that it's also used in standard German. So there is no pressure coming from the standard language to change the pronoun there.
Oh yeah, I think
right?
you're not understanding. I wasn't talking about the personal pronoun, but I was talking about the use of the auxiliary verb to do. So not German du as in you.
Oh, beg pardon.
So yeah, it's
Okay,
confusing if you mix up languages like that. My bad.
I was just dreaming off entirely on my own over here.
But that's another interesting thing. The use of the old English thou and thy.
Yeah.
Or Middle English, I should say.
I thought that was what you were getting at, because that's another point of similarity between English and Low Saxon, right? Thou, of course, this is rather general Germanic, right? Swedish du, Danish du, High German du, Low Saxon du.
Mm-hmm.
Du, die, die, thou, thee, thy. It's all exactly the same, really, as in English. And in dialectal regional English, it's still used to this day, just not in standard English, where it's been supplanted by you, which used to be a very formal, it just used to be the formal pronoun, right? But which you would address as a kind of deferential term, people of higher standing.
Yeah, and it's very, very funny you should mention that, because that flip side can be found in Twente varieties as well. Like usually the the formal form would be e or ye, and you, like in English, and the informal form would be do. But what you find in Low Saxon in my part of the country is that do used to be for a long time the formal form, only reserved for elderly, because those were the ones who still used do in their daily lives as an informal form. So in order to speak to them in a deferential manner, you address them with do and d instead of u and e. So in the minds of my parents and their grandparents, this is very confusing, I can tell. But in the minds of my parents, the use of do was very formal, whereas it used to be very informal. So it's a very interesting flip, and you'll find that flip in English as well, I think. Yes, you were saying?
I wasn't. I was thinking rather. I was reflecting on this. Yeah, I heard you explain this earlier. It's a very interesting, probably rather short-lived phenomenon.
That's one generation. I think that's because it's one generation, one step from using do to not using do at all anymore.
Okay. Now, speaking of the linguistic features of Low Saxon itself, we can maybe spare a rather brief thought for the vocabulary and expressions, if you want, before moving on to more social aspects of the language, which will probably speak more to more people. I haven't really made a list of vocabulary. I'm not sure what the point would be of just giving a random few words in Low Saxon, which really can be looked up in a dictionary. I would rather just make the comment, and this ties it into the next segment, that where Low Saxon has a substantial vocabulary, in fact, an extensive vocabulary, practically infinite, all its own, which differentiates it from Dutch, from German, from any other language. Even though there's a lot of regional variation, there's still a lot of words in common that are Saxon words that are shared in the language space and are not shared by other related Germanic languages. The thing that must be said, of course, is that a lot of this unique vocabulary is quickly being replaced by, in favor of vocabulary taken over, adopted from the standard languages.
That's right. Or from English.
Yeah, but though in the first place it would be from either Dutch or German, depending on whether you're in the Netherlands or Germany. And of course, if you're talking about information technology, in Low Saxon, a computer is a computer. So it's as simple as that. But that's the same problem that the bigger languages, the more powerful languages also deal with, or problem, if you want to see it as such, is the massive influx of English terminology that never gets to acquire its homegrown equivalents. But so a lot of the age-old vocabulary, really, that has existed for centuries, if not millennia, is very quickly dissolving into the standard languages, under the pressure of which Low Saxon is being diluted. And a common observation about the use of Low Saxon words, just normal words that happen not to exist as such recognizably in Dutch or German, is, oh, you can't say that anymore. That's so old-fashioned. Dat is just terrible. Verschrikkelijk ouderwets. Dat kun je niet meer zeggen tegenwoordig. And I like...
Och, wat allerhaftig.
I like to give the example of where not that long ago, I was speaking in Neologisms, my hometown, with somebody from there, and we were speaking Neologisms, the Low Saxon variety of the town of Neologism. And I asked for a skere. Could I have a pair of scissors? And because I said skere, they replied, "Oh, but how quaint and how wonderful that you should say skere, right, instead of schaar," right? It's like sometimes it seems like the way it's still sort of not frowned upon to use Low Saxon is to use certain of its phonetic features and maybe some of its grammar and modes of conjugation. But if you really opt for the vocabulary as it's traditionally existed in Low Saxon, which sets it apart from the standard language of the country, Dutch, it's considered to be rather odd, and fewer people do it. Like the musician Daniel Lohuus from Drenthe noticed, as he wrote in a column a while back, that the traditional word in Drenthe for onions, siepels, he heard it less and less. He just heard people just saying, even when speaking plat, speaking the regional language, they would just say uien, the Dutch word.
But with a specific Low Saxon pronunciation.
Well, yeah, sure, it can. You'd retain. That's the last. It's always the last thing to go, right? It's the accent.
Right.
Eventually, when a language dies and is replaced by another language, even people who don't speak a word of the original language, as now happens, especially, for instance, in Twente, where the language is the accent is strongly different from Standard Dutch, as pronounced in other parts of the country. Young people who don't speak a word of Twents, they'll still speak Dutch with an accent that can immediately be recognized as being Twents and as such as having come from the Low Saxon language, the Twents language.
That's right, and I'd like to add to your skere example that it's also regionally defined what words are considered old-fashioned or not, or still in daily use. People wouldn't lift an eyebrow about the word skere here, but there are words in Low Saxon here in Twente that are considered old-fashioned. Do I have an example? Well, for instance, I recently, with a friend of mine, we created a beer.
Did you?
A craft beer, and
is that an IPA?
It's sort of an IPA, and we included, or we had it brewed for us, and the brewery added juniper berry.
Berries,
and I think it's jeneverbes in Dutch.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah,
it's jeneverbes, but the Low Saxon local word for it is wakel. So
yes.
And as I was creating the beer label for on the bottles, I included the word wakel, and there were people looking at the label saying, "What the hell is wakel?" And those were people who'd been speaking Low Saxon all their life. And do you really want me to explain to you what wakel is? It's jeneverbes. Oh, never heard of it. So it's old-fashioned and we don't use it anymore. At the same time, for instance, we have a lot of blackbirds here, but the local word for it is geteling. You'll probably call it gieteling.
Gieteling, yeah.
A slightly different accent, but even the older people here call it a merel.
Yeah.
Like Turdish merula.
Yeah.
The Latinized Dutch name. And same goes for a lot of local words for herbs and spices and all that, and weeds in your garden.
Yeah. And well, I mean, it's a process that you see around the world. Everything we're describing here, what's happening on a social level, how does the language change based on current realities and the contact with other languages and languages that are frankly more powerful and more highly developed and more prestigious.
Mm-hmm.
You just see it happening the same way wherever you look. I sometimes hear it said that, well, so the argument is proposed that, well, languages change, which of course they do. So that means that if the vocabulary changes, then that's just a natural process. Well, yes, but it only changes one way, doesn't it? Virtually the only change we see is that Low Saxon words get abandoned.
Mm-hmm.
People are no longer familiar with them and get replaced with the word from the standard language, either unchanged or with possibly a Saxon phonetic feature that sort of morphs the Dutch loan in some way or another. But
would you say it erodes? Languages erode?
Well, sure, it's a form of erosion. It's a form of dilution, of watering down. Okay, which affects the character of the language. But we'll get to this in the next point, where we'll address, I guess, the question of what, is it a language, is it a dialect? But a final observation on these vocabulary shifts is it's also often observed, well, a lot of these terms we had in Low Saxon described features of the life that people lived, say, 100 years ago. And often they were farmers, so a lot of the words are for farm equipment. The equivalent words in, say, Dutch and German, most people don't know those anymore either, because we've just moved on. Society has changed, and these farming implements that were used 100 years ago have fallen by the wayside, and so naturally there's no use anymore for the corresponding words. But I would, which is fair enough, but I would say it still misses the point I just made of Low Saxon vocabulary being dropped reliably in favor of words from the standard language. It's not just about words for which there's no current, no modern need. It's not just a matter of, language changes, which is normal and natural, so nothing to see here, don't worry. Would you agree with that? Well, rather, I guess you could say pessimistic reading or fateful?
Yeah. Yes, I sometimes do believe that, or we're losing old words or beautiful words or very unique words at an alarming rate, and yeah. And the only way to stop that is to make people see how beautiful these words are, and to make people use these again, to revitalize the language itself, and to have people incorporate these words into their daily speech. But how do you do that? How do you step over this idea that it is somehow old-fashioned or backward to use older words? Sometimes I'm of the reading that it's not bad to lose an old word as long as it's replaced by something, something genuine, something unique, something authentic. That's what I was looking for. As long as it's replaced by something authentic based on your own vocabulary. Like, for instance, what happens with these knife endings, what you call them, the neologisms. Like, for instance, how we form new words based on older words. For instance, the word for telephone, we could say it's a telephone, but we can also say it's an draad of an geiedraad of an that sort of thing. But that's a way of playing with the language and
you cloakphone and strikphone,
exactly,
smartphone.
And
are those your knife endings? Are those your own inventions? Strikphone or cloakphone?
Sort of, yes. I started off by basing it on it's a phone. We don't really have difficulties pronouncing these words, right? You can pronounce them very, very easily with your own set of sounds that you have. But like phone, we all know use the word phone, like microphone, telephone, that sort of thing. I wouldn't object too much against it. But it's the smart that's different. That's the bit that is incomprehensible from a Low Saxon point of view. So I would make it a bit more playful and say it's replace it with something that describes what you're doing with the thing in your hand. So striken, to strike, to swipe, or to cloak, which is a literal translation of smart.
Yeah.
So I'd very much encourage the playing with the language to at least keep it subtle, to keep it supple. I mean,
sure. And where you asked, like, what can we do? What strategies can we employ to retain unique features of the Low Saxon language and to keep it from being diluted by the standard languages? And you mentioned blackbird in Low Saxon, gieteling or geteling. I wrote a story where it happens to involve a gieteling, a blackbird, but these stories are read by, several dozen, up to maybe a few hundred people at best. It's not going to change anything about the language, in the bigger picture. But when I hear a song, like we'll get to talk about the music scene in Low Saxon, and I hear a song, and I'm always delighted to hear when the writer of the lyrics has chosen an authentically and has successfully pulled off an authentic turn of phrase in Low Saxon, because music reaches a much bigger audience than literature. And so this expression or this word is then brought among the public again in a way that actually stands a chance of possibly sticking in the minds of listeners that may only have been half of very vaguely aware of it, maybe have heard a few times in their life, or maybe never at all. But then there it is in that song. The song gets radio play, or it's on the internet, and it's like old features of an old language are offered anew to a modern contemporary audience in a modern contemporary format that actually speaks to people.
But I'm in a bit of two minds in that, because I know the word geteling, but I wouldn't know the original words for many other bird species. So why would I be so fanatic about that one word while I wouldn't be able to tell you the rest? So it would require me to study lots of different bird names, and simply because I've taken a liking to the word geteling.
Yeah, sure. Well, for one, it's just an example. For two, it's like urban city people don't know many bird species, right? Or couldn't name in any language, couldn't name many bird varieties. But it so happens that the blackbird is one of the most common and recognizable birds around, also in the city. So while you don't necessarily have to know the Low Saxon words for birds like the jay or what do I know?
You've been in the city too long.
The speckled pied, this or that.
Yeah, exactly.
It would help to know at least sparrow, blackbird, a couple of birds that.
Yeah, but I mean, obviously it extends beyond the realm of birds. So, yeah, like some of the old-fashioned utensils that you use, or the tools in your shed. Like I remember distinctly one older speaker saying to me, do you know what a heart spit is? I think I've brought it up on several occasions. And I said,
metaphor.
What's that?
You have indeed. Yes. But I like the anecdote. Go ahead.
So there was this older man who asked me, so you're a speaker of Low Saxon then. Let's find out how well you speak it. So he presented me with the word haarspit, which on second thought is a Dutch word as well, so it's the same in Low Saxon as it is, so which is very funny as well. So, but at the time, of course, I wasn't brought up on a farm, so I wouldn't need the words for farm tools, right? Especially when they're 100 years old or older, and so I presented him with the word glookphone. Or strikphone. Would you know what that is? So, and then I had him silent for a bit, and I think he realized that I was taking the mick. Yeah, that goes to show that you could talk about this for hours, debate on whether losing your vocabulary is bad, as long as it's being replaced with something new, which we see in happening in Iceland. For instance, they have a national sport of forming new words based on the old ones.
Yeah, of course, the Icelandic situation is rather incomparable to most other situations, because the Icelanders are, inordinately proud of their language, and rightly so, because they've retained a rather archaic form of this particular Scandinavian language compared to the way that the other Scandinavian languages have developed and lost more of their erstwhile features. So the Icelanders are
erstwhile.
Yeah, is there a what would that be in Low Saxon?
The vroegste, denk ik, of yeah.
I thought you had something in mind that actually resembled erstwhile. Eerstwiels.
Eerstwiels.
So that was
That's so what can you?
Okay.
Probably. We're lapsing into Low Saxon here. Did you notice?
Well, I lapsed deliberately, just to introduce a bit of a.
But I find it very difficult to lapse back.
So, but anyway, these changes, they're not just on the level of vocabulary, of course, they're also on the level of grammar, on the level of pronunciation, on the level of when to use the language and when not, which eases us into the following point that we jotted down is, does any given variety of Low Saxon actually deserve to be called a language? Or does Low Saxon as a whole deserve to be called a language? Or is it respectively a Dutch dialect or a German dialect? Your thoughts?
Now, wouldn't the answer to that be a lovely cliffhanger for the next episode of the Saxon series? In the meantime, do leave your comments and recommendations below, and if that is the sort of thing that tickles your fancy, please do subscribe and share it with all your friends. We'd be very pleased if you did. See you in the next episode. Goed gewoon.